Have you ever wondered why snowflakes look the way they do, or how rock candy forms? Well, they go through this process called crystallization. Crystallization is the solidification of atoms or molecules into a highly structured form called a crystal. In simpler terms, crystallization turns a liquid solution, or sometimes gas, into a solid crystal form. Nucleation is the formation of a crystal in which ions, atoms, or molecules become arranged in a pattern, forming the site where additional particles are placed as the crystal grows. If the ions, atoms, or molecules are stable enough, the crystallization process may begin. An important factor during this process is how the particles are arranged, which is determined by the clustering of atoms that occurs during nucleation. There are two kinds of crystallization, the first one being natural crystallization, which includes things such as the formation of a snowflake, crystallization of honey in a jar, gemstone crystal deposition, stalactite, and stalagmite. The second kind is called artificial crystallization, which includes growing sugar crystals in a jar and the production of synthetic gemstones. The types of crystals that are formed are determined by three things: the temperature, the concentration of the particles, and the purity of the materials. There are various methods that can be used to crystallize different substances. A few methods include the cooling method, the evaporation method, the solvent diffusion method, and the vacuum sublimation method. The cooling method dissolves substances in a solvent which form crystals cooling in favorable conditions. During this method, the substance is typically heated, then set to be cooled down. This method is not used as often due to its many limitations. Next is the evaporation method, which is used much more often than the cooling method. After evaporating the solution, pure crystals are accumulated at the bottom of the flask. This method contains a high solute to solvent mass ratio because of its need for a high concentration of the substance in the solution. In the solvent diffusion method, a solution is placed in a sample tube, then another solvent that is less dense is slowly dripped down the side of the sample tube with a pipette. This method is pertinent to milligram quantities of samples that are air and/or solvent sensitive. And last but not least is the vacuum sublimation method, where you seal a sample under vacuum into a glass tube and place it into an oven for a few days or weeks. If this does not work, either turn the oven onto a higher temperature or move to a different one. In some cases, a furnace may be used instead of an oven. Here's a brief summary of everything that was talked about in this video. We learned that crystallization is the solidification of atoms or molecules into a highly structured form called a crystal. Nucleation must take place before crystallization occurs. The two kinds of crystallizations are called natural and artificial crystallization. The types of crystals that are formed are determined by the temperature, the concentration of the particles, and the purity of the material. And the last were the four methods used to crystallize substances: are cooling, evaporation, solvent diffusion, and vacuum sublimation. Now that we know more about what crystallization is and how it's used, I'm going to show you a video I made of me using a cooling method to make a treat that is enjoyed by many, called rock candy. So, on with the video. The materials I used were 2 glass cups, 2 wooden skewers, 2 clips wide enough to cover the top of the glasses, a pot to mix my ingredients in, sugar, and water. Next, I began making my sugar solution. I started by pouring 1 cup of water into the pot. Then I poured 3 cups of sugar that I had pre-measured out into a bowl into the pot. I began to mix them all together until it was mixed thoroughly. Next, I took both skewers, dipped them in water, completely covered the wet part of the stick with sugar, and set them aside to dry. This creates a platform for the rock candy to grow on. While I let my sticks dry, I placed my pot on the stove and set it to high. I continued to stir as it warmed up. When it began to boil, I started to stir the solution quickly until all the sugar had dissolved into the solution. After mixing the solution, I poured it carefully into the 2 glass bottles and let it sit for 10 minutes. When the 10 minutes was over, I placed my sugar-coated skewers into the glasses. As I put them in, I made sure not to place the skewers to where they would touch the bottom of the glass so they would grow properly. Rock candy takes about 1 to 2 weeks to grow. Here is a time lapse of what rock candy looks like as it forms during this time. This is what rock candy looks like after it is done crystallizing. The sizes can vary depending on how much sugar you add to your solution. I hope that you enjoyed this video and you learned something new about the process of crystallization. Thanks for watching.